They poured glasses like it was some sacred act, thin-stemmed flutes, shimmering rose, soft music threading the silence. I stood at the edge of the crowd, just behind a white folding table draped in linen, watching as my son raised a toast to the Emerson legacy, not our legacy, not Frank and Clara's vineyard, just his. Aaron's voice was smooth, practiced, not unlike the Pinot he now claimed to have crafted from passion. Passion. For what branding 𝗬𝗪, his wife, beamed beside him, phone tilted at the perfect angle, capturing the moment for her followers. "This land raised us," he said, lifting his glass. "And now, we raise it higher." There were nods, laughter, applause. I was not mentioned, not in the speech, not in the press kits, not even in the rows of glossy brochures placed carefully beside the charcuterie board. There were seats for guests, investors, influencers, but none for me. I didn't even have a name tag. Someone asked if I was part of the catering staff. I smiled tight, polite, and adjusted the silver pin on my lapel, a gift from Frank. Years ago. He would have hated this. Not just the showmanship, the forgetting, the erasure. I walked past the tasting tent, past rows of curated wine bottles now renamed with phrases like Harvest Horizon and Soul Terroir, names that meant nothing to the soil they came from. My name wasn't there either. I was born Clara Joan Whitmore. I became Clara Emerson when I married Frank. And now, it seemed, I had become invisible, but not absent, not powerless. I reached into my purse carefully, without trembling, and pulled out a small black phone, a number I hadn't dialed in over a year. My thumb hovered for only a second. Then I pressed call. The line rang once, twice. "Vincent Harlow." The voice answered. "Vincent," I said quietly. "It's Clara." I let the words hang. Then I added, "I think it's time. I wasn't erased from the launch. I was simply never written in." The first time I stepped onto that land, it wasn't a vineyard, it was a scar, just dry hills and the burnt skeletons of what used to be rows of Cabernet, blackened by a wildfire that had rolled through Napa like judgment. Frank stood beside me, his hand rough from weeks of clearing debris, and said, "It'll take years. Clara." I looked at the ashes, then at him, and nodded. Because that's what you do when someone believes in something impossible, you believe with them. We had no investors, no team. Just a used pickup, a second-hand rototiller, and a baby boy who still called me C because Mom belonged to someone who'd passed too soon for him to remember. I never corrected him. I never needed to. Love doesn't hinge on titles, it grows in the silences, in the breakfast bowls wiped clean, in the fevered nights when the thermometer keeps rising and you're the only one awake. Frank and I worked every corner of that land. I learned pruning from watching his hands. I learned fermentation from his mistakes. We stored our first batch of wine in the basement because we couldn't afford barrels. He crushed grapes barefoot one year, laughing like a boy, purple juice up to his knees, and I caught myself falling in love with him all over again. Not because he was strong, but because he was still tender. We took turns staying up when Aaron got sick. I taught part-time at the community college to pay for trellises. He took odd jobs at a neighbor's farm to buy irrigation tubing, and slowly, painfully, vines returned. Shoots became canopies. One summer, we harvested enough to fill 30 bottles. It felt like a miracle. We opened the first one on our anniversary. Aaron was 6 by then, and he drew us a label in crayon, Emerson's Magic Juice. We laughed until we cried. Years passed. The roots grew deeper. So did we. The land became our map, each slope and shade a memory. The western hill where Frank proposed, the flat ridge where Aaron took his first steps, the shaded patch where I once buried our old dog with my own hands because Frank couldn't bear to. We planted not just vines, but rituals. Saturday pancakes, Sunday pruning, letters on birthdays tucked into glove compartments. When a frost nearly wiped out our crop in '97, I held Frank's hand under the kitchen table while he stared into nothing. wondering if we should sell. "Just one more year," I whispered, and we gave it one more, then 5, then 10. Aaron grew up on sun and soil. He used to run barefoot between the rows, his toy truck trailing behind, asking questions like, "What's terroir?" or "Why do grapes like sloping hills?" He called Frank Dad without hesitation. With me, he stuck to C, but there were moments, little ones, when I saw the soft edge of belonging in his eyes. Like when he'd fall asleep on my shoulder during movie nights, or bring me a daisy he'd picked from the edge of the irrigation line. I never pushed. You can't force roots to take. You can only tend them, water them, wait. He left for college with a scholarship and a suitcase full of flannel. We were proud, so proud. He promised to return after graduation, maybe take over the vineyard. But years passed. Visits grew sparse. Then came Sierra, and suddenly, the questions stopped. The phone calls shortened. "It's Branding now. Mom." He once told me, except he didn't say Mom. He never had. Still, I kept his room, washed his sheets, folded his high school hoodie and placed it back on the shelf. Even when the dust started settling like memory, I didn't resent him. Not really. People grow. People leave. I just thought he'd remember what he came from, that he'd return, not just for holidays, but for harvests, for the scent of fermenting skins, for the story written in bark and sunburn. But life edits you out gently, so gently you don't notice you've become a footnote, a cautionary tale, a symbol of before in someone else's glossy after. Still, every time I walked the rows, checked the vines, or found one of Frank's old gloves stuffed in a shed drawer, I felt something anchor me. I wasn't waiting. I was keeping the land, keeping the love, keeping what mattered long after the spotlight had moved on. Because I had built this with bare hands and sleepless nights, with love, and not the loud, performative kind, the quiet love, the one that shows up at dawn, stays during drought, and knows that roots matter more than blossoms. So when Aaron stood there last week, arms around Sierra, announcing the Emerson legacy to a room full of strangers, I didn't feel anger, not at first. I just felt missing, as if someone had carefully removed me from every page, then patted my hand and said, "Thanks for your help." I wasn't invited to speak. I wasn't even listed as a founder. They called me supportive, as if support were scaffolding to be taken down once the house stood tall. But I knew better. I knew the beams, the weight, the cracks hidden beneath that polished surface. I knew because I was the one who stayed when it all nearly collapsed. And I know now something else. Something truer than branding and bottle labels. I wasn't his real mother. I was just the only one who stayed. It didn't happen all at once, this unraveling between us. There was no fight, no door slammed, no harsh words thrown like stones. Just a gradual thinning, like fog pulling back from a vineyard at dawn. You don't notice it's gone until you're squinting into light that doesn't feel warm anymore. Sierra came into Aaron's life like sunshine in a magazine, spread teeth perfect, eyes bright, all angles and affirmations. Wellness, she called it, alignment, clarity, intention. Words that floated through her like perfume but never seemed to land on anything real. When she first visited the vineyard, I made her an apple tart, the same one I'd baked for Aaron every birthday since he was 5. She took one bite, smiled politely, then pushed it aside. "Gluten," she whispered, as if it were poison. Aaron laughed and kissed her temple. "We'll get her on board." "See," he said. "She's just getting used to the place." But she never did. Not really. She preferred Napa's tasting rooms and boutique hotels over the soil that clung to your shoes for days. Frank was still alive then, his body already betraying him, but his voice still strong. He'd shake his head, watching Sierra take photos of herself with the vines while Aaron adjusted the lighting on her phone. "Do they even know what they're standing on?" he muttered once, his fingers trembling slightly as he cut a cluster from the trellis. I didn't answer. Some questions aren't looking for answers, they're mourning the ones we already know. After Frank's funeral, Aaron returned with a rebrand, a literal one. "We're refreshing the Emerson image," he said. "Cleaner design, modern typography, no more sepia-toned nostalgia." He showed me a mock-up of the new label. It didn't mention Frank. It didn't mention me. Just a stylized E and a slogan rooted in legacy, grown for tomorrow. I stared at it for a long time before speaking. "Whose legacy?" I asked. Aaron blinked, then looked away. "It's not personal. See, it's just what sells now," Sierra added. "We're aligning the brand with a new demographic, experience-focused, visual first. You know, people want stories, not dirt." I looked at her nails perfectly shaped, her phone screen always glowing, and realized she didn't see the difference. Dirt was the story. Every clump of it had fed the roots that held this place together. But the decisions came fast after that. The barn was remodeled into a hospitality center. The old sign that Frank had carved by hand was replaced with a sleek, brushed metal panel. "That's not the image we want anymore," Aaron said, touching the wood like it embarrassed him. He didn't ask me. He didn't need to. I wasn't on the paperwork. I was just still there, moving through a house slowly shrinking around me, like skin too tight for the bones beneath. Sierra's mother began visiting more often, staying in the guest room that used to be Aaron's. She posted pictures of herself sipping wine under fairy lights with captions like, "So proud of our journey." One evening, during a dinner for potential investors, Sierra stood up to make a toast. "To the women who made this possible," she said, raising her glass. "To my mom, my inspiration, to my husband, my partner, to the Emerson legacy we're all building together." I waited. 1 beat, 2, 3. My name didn't come. No one turned to me. Not even Aaron. The silence was so casual it felt rehearsed. Afterward, I cleared the dishes. No one noticed. That night, I sat on the back steps, staring at the vineyard as the solar lights clicked on. The rows looked the same, but the air had shifted. It didn't carry memory anymore. Just branding, just curated experience. Aaron joined me with a glass in hand. "You okay? See?" he asked, not quite meeting my eyes. "You've been quiet." I wanted to ask him where he'd gone. Not physically, he was here, in this place, but not of it anymore. I wanted to ask if he remembered the feel of crushed grape skins between his fingers, the warmth of Frank's hand guiding his wrist during his first pruning. But I didn't. Instead, I said, "Quiet is easier than being left out." He winced. "It's not like that." But it was. It had been for a long time. I sipped my tea, now lukewarm, and whispered, "I just hope the vines still know who we were." He didn't reply, just looked out into the rows, where everything was growing and nothing remembered who planted it. They didn't silence me. They just spoke everything except my name. The sun hadn't fully set when Aaron laid the folder on the kitchen table, the same table Frank and I had stained with cherry varnish in '87, the one where we wrote the first wine labels by hand and cut Aaron's birthday cakes for 17 years. "It's time we think about the future," he said, like it was a gift he was offering me instead of a sentence. Sierra stood behind him, arms crossed, lips glossed in the color of dried plums. I hadn't seen her smile all week, not since the last of the condolence cards stopped arriving. I sat down slowly, the ache in my knees louder than usual, but not louder than the tightening in my chest. "What future?" I asked, though I already knew. Aaron flipped open the folder branding mock-ups, flowcharts, slides filled with percentages and projections. "Legacy Wines," it said across the top, in serif font. "Global distribution by Q4. My name wasn't anywhere on the page. Frank's was, though, used like a monogram, like seasoning, sprinkled across slogans they'd never understand. "We've signed a letter of intent," Sierra said, her voice flat, almost bored. with a development group based in Seattle. They want to expand Emerson into a lifestyle brand, wines, retreats, even a skincare line sourced from our grape waste. It's cutting edge. I blinked. Grape waste. She nodded. It's holistic, regenerative, as if those words could ever rebuild what they were casually destroying. And who approved this? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Aaron looked at me like I'd missed a memo. We did. Dad and I discussed it last year. I stared at him. You mean while he couldn't hold a pen? He was lucid. Aaron snapped. He understood what this place needed to survive. I held out my hand. Show me. He slid a document across the table. The paper was crisp, too crisp. Not our family lawyer's letterhead. Just a digital template, printed clean and cold. I traced the signature at the bottom. Frank Emerson. Too straight, too smooth, too unlike the man whose hands had curled into themselves by spring, whose signature had begun to shake as early as December. You had him sign this, I said, barely hearing myself. While he was medicated, Sierra spoke up. He was aware. It's legal. We had it notarized. I looked up at her, then at Aaron, his jaw set, eyes unblinking, and in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about legacy. It was about liquidation. They weren't saving anything. They were cashing in. You planned this, I said softly. Before he died. Aaron didn't deny it, just sat down, elbows on the table like it belonged to him now. You don't have to do anything. See, we've arranged everything. There's a cottage for you outside Sonoma. Sunny pines. It's lovely. Sierra picked the decor herself. I laughed, but it came out as something closer to a cough. A retirement home? Not a home, Sierra corrected. A community? They have a vineyard view? I pushed the folder away. I'm not going anywhere. Aaron's mouth tightened. Mom, and it was the first time he'd called me that in months. Maybe years. You're 70? You shouldn't be worrying about frost warnings and soil pH. Let us carry it now. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just reached for the tea kettle and poured into the cup in front of me. My hands didn't shake. You think I'm tired? I asked. You think I did all this just to be put aside when the prophets came in? It's not like that, Aaron said again. But it was. Every moment since Frank got sick, every meeting I wasn't part of, every password changed, every file moved to cloud drives I couldn't access. They'd been erasing me one polite gesture at a time. You're not on the deed, Sierra said, her tone turning sharper. Technically, it's all in Frank's name. That's how it was filed. Legally. I stared at her, at the stranger who now stood in my kitchen explaining how I had no place in the life I'd spent 40 years building. He trusted me, I whispered. And you trust documents. It's cleaner this way, Aaron added. The developers need full control. They'll pay more if there's no dispute. I nodded slowly. Cleaner. I looked around the kitchen, the nick in the cabinet where Aaron bumped his bike, the faded chart of pruning cycles Frank made in pencil and never took down, the drawer that still stuck when it rained. I need to pack a few things. I said, if I'm leaving, I'll need my medication, a few clothes. Aaron seemed relieved. Of course. Take what you need. I stood, my joints stiff, but my spine straight. I'll go upstairs now. And I did, one step at a time, each stair a memory. I didn't cry. Not then, not when I opened the dresser and found it already empty, not when I saw the small suitcase neatly zipped, like I was a guest being gently escorted out, not even when I touched the edge of the bed Frank had died in, now covered in a folded blanket I didn't recognize. No, I saved my tears for later, for a time when they'd be mine alone. I wasn't pushed out of the legacy. I was simply folded out of the story. They called it the cottage, tucked behind a low slope at the edge of the vineyard, far enough from the main house to feel like exile, close enough to look intentional, like a thoughtful arrangement. It had once been Frank's tool shed, renovated during Aaron's brief obsession with Airbnb investing. It had wood paneling, a tiny kitchenette, one window with a partial view of the grapevines, and a door that didn't quite close unless you leaned your full weight against it. "We thought you might like some independence," Sierra said brightly, handing me the key like she was offering a gift. Her nails were painted a color named something like fog or hush. I didn't respond. I took the key and walked in alone. It smelled like lavender cleaning spray and fresh linen neutral, sanitized, like a hotel waiting to forget you. The bed was neatly made. The small closet already held a few of my sweaters. Someone, probably her, had unpacked the suitcase I didn't pack myself. My books weren't there. Neither was the tin box of photographs I kept in the hallway drawer. Only the bare essentials, as if my life had been boiled down to what could fit in 2 bags and a bullet point summary. I stood in the center of the room for a long time. There was a chair by the window, the kind people describe as cozy when they mean confined. I sat there as the sun sank over the ridge. I could see the top rows of the vineyard from this angle, just barely the tips of leaves catching gold. But I couldn't see the house, couldn't see the barn, couldn't see the porch where Frank used to read aloud in the evenings, his voice low and careful, savoring every line of poetry like it might escape. I don't remember falling asleep, only waking in the middle of the night with my neck stiff and the silence pressing against the windows. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels intentional. The next morning, Sierra came knocking with a cup of green juice and a ring light in her other hand. "Just a quick story for the vineyard page," she said, brushing windblown hair from her face. "We're doing a little feature on the roots of Emerson, and we thought it'd be sweet to show you settling in." She propped her phone on the sill, adjusted the light, then gestured for me to smile. I didn't. She smiled wider. "Okay, let's try again. Maybe tell us how this little cottage makes you feel close to Frank." I opened my mouth, then closed it. My hands were folded in my lap. I waited. She waited. Then, finally, she huffed and stopped recording. "It's fine. I'll use B-roll." She left the juice behind. I didn't drink it. Instead, I made tea the way Frank liked it, black, no sugar, and held the cup in both hands like I was bracing for weather. Around noon, Aaron came by. He didn't knock. Just opened the door and stood there like someone visiting a tenant. "We've set the closing date with the developers," he said. "It's happening next Thursday." I nodded. He seemed disappointed by how little I reacted. "See? Are you okay?" I met his eyes. "You tell me." He looked away, muttered something about meetings, and left before I could say anything more. I spent the next 3 days watching the vineyard from my window, watching men in suits come and go, watching Sierra film walkthroughs, watching Aaron practice his speech in the mirror they'd installed in the guest bathroom. "Legacy isn't about the past," he said. "It's about evolution. Frank once said legacy is what you plant knowing you'll never see it bloom. He said that in the first year we almost gave up. When the frost bit half the crop and the bank threatened foreclosure, he said it with dirt under his nails and a tremor in his voice. And now, it was just a tagline, a line rehearsed in a mirror. On the 4th morning, I woke to the sound of laughter. Sierra and her mother were walking past the window. "We're thinking of putting a pergola here," her mother said. "Great view. Would be perfect for influencer brunches." Sierra giggled. "And maybe a fire pit. Rustic chic vibes." I stood behind the curtain, unseen, uncounted. And then I saw something that made my hands go cold. A new sign being carried across the gravel path. Legacy Estate. Estimated, 2023. No mention of Frank. No mention. No mention of history. No mention of anything that mattered. That night, I sat in the dark and opened the bottom drawer of the tiny nightstand. There, behind the neatly folded guest towels, was the thing I'd hidden years ago, a backup key to the main house, taped behind an old photograph of Aaron as a boy, holding a watering can. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just stared at it, the weight of metal cold in my hand. They thought they had removed me, tucked me away like an heirloom no longer worth display. But I was still here. I was always here. And I wasn't done. They didn't exile me. They just dressed my absence in sunlight and called it peace. It was behind the lowest drawer, tucked so far back I had to press my whole arm into the narrow cabinet, knocking over a forgotten bottle of lavender spray and a stack of floral napkins someone had arranged like I was meant to host tea parties in this exile. The glass clinked softly round, dusty, wrapped in burlap the way Frank used to do when he bottled something not meant for sale. The handwriting on the tag had faded, but I recognized it instantly. C.J.W. My maiden initials. Only Frank would have written them like that, neat, deliberate, with a slight slant to the J like it was leaning toward home. I pulled the bottle out slowly, the cork sealed with deep red wax. Tucked under the wrapping was a folded slip of paper, yellowed at the edges. My hands didn't tremble as I opened it. The ink had bled a little, but the words were clear. If you're reading this, then you know it's time. The land behind the irrigation line, 5 acres. With the spring and the old stone wall, it's in your name. I transferred it when we refinanced in 2009. Vincent has the deed. I didn't tell the kids. Not out of distrust, just instinct. Call him if you need to. Frank. My breath caught not from surprise, but from the sudden weight of being seen, of being remembered, of being trusted, even in absence. 5 acres, the most fertile patch on the property. The one with the original vine stock, the roots we had nurtured from shoots bought with grocery money and sleepless nights. The section that fed the rest, both in water and in spirit. I pressed the letter to my chest, not for drama, just to feel it, the echo of him, that small, steady voice that had whispered over and over in our 40 years together. We're in this. I've got you. I stood slowly, the bottle still in my hand. The wax was cracked with age. I didn't open it. Not yet. It wasn't wine now, it was memory. A boundary line. A start. That night, I didn't sleep in the cottage bed. I sat in the chair by the window, watching shadows stretch across the rows of vines like old arms reaching for something already gone. Somewhere in the main house, I heard music. Sierra's playlist, soft jazz, curated calm. It didn't touch me. Nothing in that house touched me anymore. But this paper in my hands, this bottle sealed like a message across time, this was real. This was mine. At dawn, I made tea in the tiny kettle, carried it to the desk, and began a list. Not a plan. Not yet. Just names. Vincent, Harold from the bank, the soil assessor from the county who'd always respected Frank, the woman from the paper, Sophia, who once interviewed us about sustainability and cried when Frank quoted 𝗦𝗲𝗿. I didn't know what I'd do with these names. Not exactly. But I knew the silence had ended. I knew the stillness they thought meant surrender was just the breath before a storm. And I knew I wasn't waiting for their permission. Not anymore. I wasn't left a goodbye. I was left a key hidden in glass and memory. The first call was to Vincent. I waited until the sky went fully dark and the vineyard disappeared into silhouette. No longer rows of memory, but shadows stacked upon one another, heavy and silent. I used the prepaid phone I kept wrapped in an old scarf, the one Frank insisted we carry just in case after that night our truck broke down on Route 12 and no one stopped for 3 hours. Clara, Vincent said as if he had been expecting me, though I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. Frank left a note. I said, the deed to the 5-acre parcel behind the stone wall. It's mine. There was a pause on the line. Then, quiet affirmation. I have the documents. He filed it in 2009 just like he said he would. I swallowed something sharp. I need copies. And I need you to prepare an injunction to block any pending transfer of the larger estate, based on potential fraud. I'm not done here. You'll have them in the morning, he said. What else do you need? I looked at the bottle on the desk, unopened, glowing faintly in the lamplight like it was lit from within. I need people who remember who we were before they turn this place into a slogan. The next call was to Harold Winters at the bank. His wife answered first, confused, until she heard my name. Harold's awake, she said. He always is around harvest. He sounded older than I remembered, softer but still sharp when I explained what had been done in Frank's name, how the account signatories had been changed without notification, how the vineyard's remaining funds had shifted into new LLCs within weeks of the funeral. That doesn't sound like Frank, he muttered. It wasn't, I replied. Can you freeze activity until further review on your word alone? On Frank's, I said, then added, and the documents I'll bring tomorrow. He agreed. Slowly, like a man choosing sides between history and convenience. I didn't blame him. People like Aaron speak clean. They wear certainty like aftershave. But Harold had known us too long. He'd tasted our first bitter batch and toasted the 15th harvest in our kitchen with his boots still muddy. He would remember. I hung up and crossed Harold's name off the list. One down. Next was the county office. Martin Adams, agricultural compliance officer. I hadn't seen him since the year he tried to convince Frank to go digital with crop records, and Frank offered him a notebook instead. Clara, he said when he picked up, voice low. Heard you were back. I never left, I said, and it startled me how true it sounded. I told him about the 5-acre deed, about the spring, about how the new buyers were planning structures near protected wetlands. You're not supposed to know that, he said, half laughing. I'm not supposed to be erased, either, I replied. Can you do anything? I'll get the maps pulled. If they're building over the water table, it's a problem. I thanked him, and he added before hanging up, Frank would have been proud of you. I stared at the phone for a long time after that. The next number I called wasn't on my list. It was muscle memory. Sophia Delaney, editor of the local paper. Frank's second cousin on his mother's side, the one who had framed our first front-page clipping when Emerson Vineyards made top 10 small estates in Napa. Clara, she said, breathless, I've been hoping you'd call. They're selling everything, I said, on fake signatures, under a fake narrative. Tell me everything, she whispered. So I did. For 40 minutes. I told her the parts they left out of the speeches and the press kits. I told her about Frank's fingers curled too tight to sign. About the branded cottage they called a kindness. About Sierra's live streams and Aaron's polished rehearsals. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she simply said, front page. By the time I ended the 7th call, it was nearly 3 a.m. The tea had gone cold. My back ached from the chair, but I wasn't tired. I was more awake than I'd been in months. For the first time since the silence began, I wasn't just remembering, I was acting. Outside, the wind stirred the vines. The rows looked like soldiers waiting in darkness. I stood at the window, the bottle of wine still sealed, the letter still resting beside it, and whispered aloud into the empty room. They think I've gone quiet, but I was just gathering breath. They didn't hear me scream. I just never raised my voice until it mattered. The sun hadn't climbed fully over the hills when I walked into the main house, but the air already smelled like citrus cleanser and synthetic calm, the kind Sierra preferred scents that gave the illusion of freshness while masking decay. Aaron stood in the kitchen, scrolling through emails on his phone, dressed like a man who was about to impress a boardroom full of people who had never stepped into a vineyard. I placed the folded deed on the counter without a word. He didn't notice it at first, too busy tapping back a message. Then his eyes landed on the paper, and I saw at the brief flicker of something unpracticed. What's this? He asked, his voice tight. Your obstacle, I replied. He unfolded the document, brows knitting as he scanned. No, this isn't possible. It's legal, I said, filed and notarized. Frank transferred the deed to the 5-acre parcel in my name. You remember the one, the original slope? The spring? The stone wall? He blinked. That section's critical for the development. The water rights exactly. I said, you're not just selling a vineyard, Aaron. You're trying to sell a legacy without owning the heart of it. He placed the paper down too carefully, as if breaking it might undo its truth. We can still talk. Right, there's room to know, I said, my tone soft but final. You don't get to orchestrate betrayal and then ask for grace. I left him there, standing beside a counter he'd never scrubbed, in a kitchen he'd only returned to when it was sanitized of memory. Vincent was waiting when I arrived at his office, legal pad ready, eyes sharper than his age allowed. Emergency injunction, I said. Fraudulent transfer. Potential elder abuse. I want every transaction frozen. I want their funding suspended. And I want you to notify the developer that the parcel they need sits outside the sale. He gave a low whistle. You're not pulling punches. They didn't, I answered, within 3 hours. Vincent had filed motions in court. Harold had frozen the vineyard's accounts citing suspicious activity, and Martin Adams had confirmed that any construction near the spring would trigger environmental protections that would make development nearly impossible. I sat in the corner of Vincent's office watching the clock and letting the weight of it settle into my bones, not heaviness, but foundation. Not exhaustion, but clarity. At 1:17 p.m., the prepaid phone buzzed. I let it ring 4 times before answering. You're going to destroy everything, Aaron said, and for the first time, his voice held something close to fear. No, I replied. I'm going to protect it. You just didn't think I still could. Sierra took the phone next. We didn't mean for it to go this far, she said, her tone pitched between apology and performance. We just thought you'd be happier, simpler life, less stress. Don't package abandonment as a wellness retreat. I said, it's not branding, it's betrayal. Please, she whispered. What do you want? What I wanted, I said slowly, was to be asked, was to be remembered, was to be more than the woman who packed the boxes and poured the wine and stood in the shadows while my husband was turned into a logo. There was a pause. Then Aaron again. You can't win. See, we'll fight you in court. We'll drag this out. You'll be broke by the end. I closed my eyes and pictured Frank's hands, how they trembled at the end, how he pressed the pen into my fingers when he could no longer hold it himself. Then you'll lose more than land, I said. You'll lose whatever good name your father built for you, because people remember, and the soil remembers. I hung up. That evening, I walked the rows of the vineyard, not like a victim reclaiming her place, but like a woman who never left. My steps were steady, my hands brushing the vines that had outlived storms and blight and fire. I stopped at the edge of the parcel they thought they could erase and dug my heel into the dirt. This was where we started, and this was where I would hold the line. The next morning, Sophia published the story. The headline was simple: The Vineyard War, What We're Not Told About Legacy. Within hours, the article spread beyond the county. Emails came in, old partners, former employees, community leaders, people I hadn't heard from in years, all offering help, all remembering who I had been before they tried to make me disappear. At 3:47 p.m., the second call came. Okay, Aaron said, his voice stripped of polish. We'll sign whatever you want. Just, please don't press charges. Bring Melissa, I said. Bring the paperwork. Bring your silence. What do you mean? I mean you will sign. You will leave. And you will not return, not to the land, not to the house, not to the name. I didn't wait for his answer. Some boundaries don't require approval. They only require resolve. I wasn't written out of the will. I just never agreed to vanish quietly. They left the same way they arrived, separately, silently, with the illusion of control melting behind their eyes. Melissa was the first to sign. her fingers trembling as she gripped the pen like it might dissolve if she hesitated too long. Her signature more smudge than stroke. She didn't speak until the last page, and even then it was only a whisper. I didn't know what he planned. Not all of it. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have words, but because none of them would matter now. Guilt only weighs something when it's carried before consequence, not after. Aaron sat straighter, his signature bold and angry, the kind of line a man draws when he's still convincing himself he's right. "This is a mistake," he said quietly, but not to me, to himself, to the version of his reflection that still thought money could outvote memory. I watched his face as he slid the documents back across the table, and in that moment I didn't see the boy who used to sit beside me in the vines and ask why grapes liked hills. I saw a man who had walked so far from his roots he mistook silence for victory. Vincent notarized each signature, filed them with a nod, and slipped the folder into the safe behind his desk. "That's that," he said softly. But it wasn't. Not for me. For them, it was the end of a transaction. For me, it was the beginning of a restoration. When they left the office, I didn't follow. I watched through the window as Aaron climbed into his rental car without looking back. Melissa into the convertible Frank once helped her buy. She paused at the wheel, stared into the distance for a breath too long, then drove off without turning her head. It struck me then how final some goodbyes are, not because we slam doors, but because we stop reaching for the handle. I returned to the farmhouse late that afternoon. It looked untouched from the outside, as if time had paused in the ivy crawling up the porch beams, in the shape of Frank's rocking chair still angled toward the west. But inside, it was colder, polished, stripped. Every photo of us had been replaced with framed mantras in brushed gold. Legacy begins with vision. Success is crafted. I removed each one with deliberate hands and stacked them in a box beside the stairs. In the kitchen, I found the old cutting board still hidden behind a stack of granite serving platters, its surface carved with lines from decades of dinners. Its center bowed slightly from use. I placed it gently on the counter. I didn't cry. I simply remembered. In the closet, Frank's flannels hung untouched, each one a soft monument to a man who never needed words to say everything. I touched the collar of the navy one he wore on our 25th harvest, the one stained with crushed 𝗓𝗧 skins and hope. In the drawer beside our bed, the pruning shears waited dull, a little rusted, but real. I slid them into my palm, heavy with the weight of repetition. Downstairs, I swept the floor, not because it needed it, but because it was mine again. I boiled water in the old steel kettle with the dent near the handle and poured a cup of tea that tasted like October used to. I lit a fire with the last few logs Frank chopped before the tremors took his grip. It took longer than I expected, the match catching on the third try, the paper curling inwards like it remembered being something else. That night, I didn't sleep in the cottage. I stayed in our room. I wore his flannel shirt over my nightdress and lay on top of the quilt his mother gave us on our wedding day. The walls didn't creak like strangers anymore. They just breathed. In the morning, I opened every window, let the orchard air move through every hallway. The vineyard had survived them, and so had I. I made a list that day of names to call, of people to bring back, not employees, not staff, people who had harvested alongside us, who remembered the way Frank hummed under his breath when the fruit was good, people who would return not for salary, but for soil. That evening, I walked the land, alone. I walked the old rows, the forgotten rows, the wild edges they deemed inefficient. I paused at the base of the hill we planted first, the one with the crooked trellis Frank never bothered to straighten because, as he said, even vines deserve to lean sometimes. I touched the wood. I breathed. I stayed there until the stars came out. No camera, no quote, no lens between me and the sky. Just the trees, just the night, just me still here, They didn't lose the land. They just lost their right to belong to it. The house creaked like it was remembering how to breathe with me inside it again. The floors no longer echoing with unfamiliar heels or staged laughter, just the steady rhythm of my steps returning, again and again, to the same places: sink, stair, porch rail, bedside drawer, like a song I knew before I knew words. The light hit different now, not because the windows had changed, but because I could finally stand still without checking who was watching, without asking if I was in the way. I had cleared every shelf, every frame, every trace of the life they tried to overwrite with their polished slogans and neutral palettes. And in its place, I let quiet things return: the wooden spoon Frank once whittled from the broken handle of our first pruning shears, the crooked harvest basket with the soft split on one side that we never fixed because it always held just enough, the faded tea towel from our 20th anniversary embroidered with tiny vines and the initials of a woman they never called mother, but whom the vineyard always knew. I didn't need applause. I didn't need forgiveness. I needed this stillness, this soft restoration built not on triumph, but on truth. I started small, one row at a time, one name, one task. I called back the vineyard hands who hadn't left because of poor yields, but because the air had grown cold with performance. I brought back Martin's niece, who used to press the grapes barefoot and sing while doing it, and she cried when I handed her the key to the fermentation room. I offered Lisa a full-time role, not because she asked, but because she stayed late after every shift without being told, because she remembered to water the rosemary when no one else noticed it browning. I took down the polished steel sign at the gate and replaced it with a slab of old wood Frank once planned to carve, but never did